Welcome to Inside and Beyond podcast, where we continue to explore the topics of consciousness, psychology, and the true capabilities of the human mind. I'm your host, Natalia Fomichenko. Today with me is a friend of mine, Tom Galea. He is a CEO and founder of Lumenate Growth. It is an amazing product that I have been an avid user myself. It is an application that uses light to help users to explore their subconscious mind. But I would like you, Tom. Hi, Tom. First of all,
Hey,
welcome to the show. I'm super happy that you were able to join.
thanks. Yeah, super excited to be here too.
Perfect. So, yes, would you like to explain yourself to our listeners what Luminate is all about? Because I've been trying to do that for my friends, and I always find myself lacking words. So,
Of course, I'll do
the
my
floor is
best
yours.
anyway. So we set about trying to find way to give people easy access to their subconscious minds. And the way that we ended up doing this was using the flashlight on the back of the phone. So it flickers at specific frequencies, which then synchronizes your brain waves. This then allows us to guide the user into a sort of state somewhere between deep meditation and psychedelics. The experience is done with their eyes closed and the flashlight fairly close to their eyes. And during it, people
Mhm.
experience reduction in sense of ego, reduction in sense of time, some of the things that we associate with psychedelic like experiences, and also, most
Mhm.
notably, typically a colorful kaleidoscope of colors, which is constantly shifting and moving around throughout
Yeah.
their experience.
Yeah, that's definitely what I have experienced myself. It's almost like you see multiple colors and shapes, and you almost sometimes can feel that an emotion that you're feeling has certain color or shape. So it's very interesting experience. But the question is, why do we need those experiences? I mean, besides the fact that it's definitely fun.
Yeah, so originally, when me and Jay, my co-founder, set out to try and create Luminate, we weren't specifically looking at the idea of tapping into your subconscious. We were instead focused far more on trying to guide people towards living more fulfilling lives. This took us
Mhm.
on a very long, winding journey with loads of research of different things through the ages, bringing us to this idea that this sense of fulfillment is driven from successive personal growth cycles. So each time gaining a new perspective, from this new perspective, stepping outside of your comfort zone and growing into an area that you weren't previously that you didn't feel like you were capable of. This continually progresses you towards your sort of ideal future state and gives you this sense of fulfillment. From there, we
Mhm.
started mapping out like, okay, great. So we want to give people this shift in perspectives, but how do we want to go about doing this? And we started interviewing loads of people about turning points in their lives, trying to understand how people are reaching these different points. And we mapped out, I think, about 18 different types of inspiration or ways to gain a new perspective. But one which fascinated us on a personal level, and we also thought the world really needed, was this easy access to their subconscious and this ability to enter an altered state of consciousness in which they could gain this
Mhm.
perspective and enter these personal growth cycles and move towards fulfillment. So hopefully that journey starts to explain a little bit as to why we think it's important to do this.
Yeah, for sure. It's super interesting. I'm curious though, how does light work exactly so that it promotes this sense of fulfillment or this desire to grow?
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to the light's ability to elicit this altered state of consciousness. So I'll start with that part and then perhaps talk about how that altered state of
Yeah,
consciousness then enables this sense of fulfillment.
sounds
So
good.
on the altered state of consciousness itself, as the flashlight flickers, it's doing this really quite fast, normally, yeah, around 10 times a second or higher or lower, around that sort of area. And as it's flickering, each time it flashes, the neurons in your brain sort of light up in response to it as they see this stimulus. And bit by bit, this sort of spreads out through the brain. And we saw this really quite strongly within our early EEG studies, which we ran. And by guiding the brain into this state, we're able to, yeah, steer people into this altered state of consciousness. There's some really interesting research going on at the moment in Berlin, which looks to not only look at this through an EEG lens, but also run some of the first fMRI studies in this space, which will hopefully help us understand a little bit more about the role of the default mode network within this as well. But our understanding, or our assumption anyway, is that this communication, similar to with psychedelics, plays an important role. And it's this sort of quietening of that part of the brain, which results in a sort of letting go of that sense of ego, time, and bringing you into that present moment, that enables you to then gain a new perspective on the things that are going on. So you might go into an experience thinking about something that's happening in your life, perhaps a problem, perhaps an ambition. And in your normal waking day consciousness, you find yourself going through the same loops or the same repetitive patterns thinking about this. By shifting your state of consciousness temporarily, it allows you to look in on it from a slightly different perspective or a slightly shifted viewpoint. And just that act of shifting that perspective to in a slightly different direction can be all you need to suddenly reveal the next piece of that puzzle and start moving forwards and start progressing those thoughts.
Yeah, and I want to add a little bit more details into the explanation of default mode network, because this is one of the most fascinating things in the brain that I personally am interested in. And from the research that I've done, I know that this is a part of the brain that acts almost like a filter of everything that comes into your sensory organs, like your visual information, your auditory information. And then this part of the brain basically defines what it is that you're saying, what it is that you're hearing. The same goes with memory. So everything that you've accumulated, all the information about yourself that makes you you, also is accumulated in this part of the brain. So now when we alter the state of consciousness, like with Lumenate or with psychedelics, this particular area of the brain, default mode network, it quieten, and therefore the feeling of sort of what makes you you somehow dissolves, and that's what they call ego dissolution. And same goes for the sensory information that you perceive, because now you don't have these filters. So that's why sometimes you can hear colors or you can see sounds, because information comes in unfiltered, and that helps you to really experience it differently, and as you said, gain new perspectives on different thoughts and feelings or emotions that you might have been experiencing before entering this state.
And I think
am I correct?
you are indeed. I think a really nice way that Michael Pollan puts it actually is by quietening the default mode network, you're firing the conductor and letting the orchestra play, which I think is a really poetic way of seeing it. And I think it's worth stressing on that point as well, that actually most of the time having a conductor to lead an orchestra is a very useful thing. It keeps it organized and keeps things working smoothly. And that is also the role that our default mode network often plays. But there is also a beauty in shaking that up sometimes and removing that conductor and seeing what emerges from the sort of chaos that comes from it. I would far from argue that the default mode network sort of slows our progress in everyday life. In fact, it's very needed and it's evolved there for a reason. But sometimes quietening that down for a short period of time does just give that different perspective.
Yeah, that's true. It's almost like resetting your computer.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. And if it sort of works the same way as psychedelics, I guess working with light is much more accessible and less scaring, especially for those who haven't experienced this before. Because when you're on a psychedelic trip, you basically don't have a way out till it finishes. Whereas with light, at least in my experience of Luminate, it can be stopped basically when the session stops. So you are in full control.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for our users as well, and something that as part of creating an accessible altered state of consciousness, we really wanted to focus on. When we did some early customer research or just interviews with people out on the street, one of the big blockers to stop people from engaging with these altered states of consciousness was this fear of loss of control, this worry about
Yeah.
it spiraling out, and this bad trip concern that a lot of people talk about. So we wanted to create something which was always within the user's control. So at any
Mm-hmm.
point, you can move the phone closer to make the experience more intense, or move it back to lessen that. Or if at any point you want to, you can simply just turn the phone away and the experience instantly stops. To me, although there are some advantages as well with surrendering to the psychedelic experience, this offers up a different angle on this and allows people to explore things that maybe they wouldn't be comfortable entering in an experience they know is going to last longer. I think
Mm-hmm.
just one thing to add to that, though, is that, as I said at the beginning, we definitely don't see the state that we can produce as this fully psychedelic state of consciousness. It has
Yeah.
aspects of that for sure, and some really intriguing and exciting ones for the potential therapeutic value going forwards. But it does sit somewhere more between a deeply meditative state and a psychedelic state.
Yeah. Is quieting default mode network the only effect, or does it do something else? Like, for instance, does it change your brainwave frequency?
So we are able to, through this technology, shift your brainwave frequencies quite notably, and that's one of the sort of core actions that we're working on. In fact, the default mode network side of things, right now we have some evidence pointing towards it, but the research in Berlin will really aim to clarify whether that
Mm,
is exactly what's
I
going
see.
on or
Yeah.
whether there's another piece going on within that. Another piece, which again I think requires a little explaining, but is probably worth bringing up, is this measure of brain entropy, or signal complexity. So within psychedelic states and lots of other conscious altering states, this very closely ties in with the subjective experience intensity of the experience of what's going on. And it's essentially the amount of chaos or complexity within the signal in the brain. I think so. This metric was actually originally created to measure as people are being sedated or anesthetized, and it was measured as a reduction from normal waking consciousness. But
Mm,
about
mm-hmm.
5 or so years ago, I think, they ran it on a psychedelics group and found that actually it increased, so moved significantly in the
Mm,
opposite direction, which was a really interesting finding for this sort of, as the newspapers reported, at a higher state of consciousness, which
mm,
is slightly questionable on the definition, but it made a good headline.
mm.
But we've proven through our studies and had these backed up through other university studies that through Lumenate, you're also increasing this level of signal complexity and this level of entropy. Um,
Mm.
so I guess that's another correlate which goes towards both the subjective psychedelic experience and the neurological one that can be measured.
Let me know if I am right, because I am thinking about another topic that I've researched about brain waves essentially. And from what I understand, in our normal waking consciousness, when we interact with environment and people, it's beta wave. Now, when we are a little bit more calmed down and we are just, lost in thoughts if you want, but we are still very much awake, it's alpha waves. Now, when we are even more quiet, when we are in between wakefulness and sleep, this state when we are almost asleep but we are still not, or we are almost awake but we are not, then it's theta wave. And those are the brain wave frequencies that make us more suggestible, that are used in hypnosis, and that's what I thought is happening on psychedelics. Then from what I know, there is delta wave, which is very quiet when you're basically in a deep sleep. And then there is gamma wave, which is actually much more excited than beta. So it's much more fast than in a beta state. However, from the outside, you appear as if you are in a deep trance. So that's, the achievement of true great meditators, so to say. So, first of all, is this your worldview of things? And second of all, where does Luminate fall into on these
Yeah, of
frequencies?
course. So I would agree with some of with most of what you said as a generalization. I think it's important to note with it, though, that in most states of consciousness, there are all these waves happening at different amounts.
Mm,
And there are these generalizations as to the way someone might be feeling if they are having a high amount of this frequency or that frequency do tend to apply. They are they are still somewhat generalizations that fit through
mm.
there. In terms of the frequencies that Luminate is able to create, so it comes as a mixture really between the ones which we guide people to and then the ones which form because of the altered state experience. But we typically try and move people from this sort of beta space, as you correctly identified, and then shift down anywhere between sort of beta and higher alpha as well. And we'll shift between these and use them as ways to sort of modulate the energy of the experience as it goes through. And we do that alongside the music, which we've had specially written for our experiences. And
Yeah, I love the
also,
music, by
oh,
the
well,
way.
thank you very much. I originally, and still about half the app's music was actually written by myself as my first ever
Oh,
music
wow.
production. When we were
Wow, I didn't
creating
know
it,
that.
we did not have the budget for a musician. So I said, you know what? I've played a bit of guitar. Let me sit down and see if I can do it. And
You definitely
many
did.
months later, we had a body of music to work with. But yeah, so we try and match the energy of the music and the energy that we want someone to be feeling with the light sequence. But again, I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say it's like this perfect one-to-one mapping of like, oh, we shoot for theta and therefore someone instantly feels this, or we shoot for this and someone instantly feels that. I would
Yep.
say as you move towards the higher frequency, there is a sense of higher energy and more like liveliness, and as the lower ones, there is more of a sense of restfulness and calm and openness.
Mm,
But
I see.
it's not quite as sort of like neat and one-to-one mapping. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And do you know which frequency dominates on psychedelic experience?
So I think one of the more interesting aspects and the more evidenced aspects in virtually all psychedelic experiences is this actual removal of peak alpha activity. So peak alpha is as you've got your eyes closed and you're in a resting state. This is naturally where your brain focuses, and virtually everyone has this spike that's typically around 10 to 12 hertz. For different
Mm-hmm.
people, it's in a slightly different place. Some people actually have two little spikes. But yeah, it's in that kind of area. And when people are in a psychedelic state, particularly a strong one, this peak alpha activity just completely subsides and removes. And that frequency then sort of gets spread out elsewhere. And
Mm,
that is, again, something that within Luminate we have been able to measure and show that especially in certain people, particularly those who are more absorbed within the experience, there is this removal of peak alpha activity, sometimes to a similar degree as with psychedelic experiences,
mm-hmm.
which right now there isn't a firm grasp as to what this signifies in the brain. There's some belief again that it might correlate to the default mode network activity, but again,
Mm,
that's purely hypothesized and the evidence base behind it isn't rock solid.
I
Um,
see.
but that's one of the things that we measured early on. And again, because of that hypothesized belief in the default mode network, we were fortunate enough to be asked to go and present out to Robin Carhart Harris and his team at Imperial. And we sort of ran them through our thinking around that. And yeah, they'd got some evidence that it could be in line. But again, I wouldn't want to make a solid comment on their behalf.
Yeah, yeah. Is there any solid evidence from what you already have acquired as to how the light affects the brain?
Yeah, so the solid evidence that we've got is we see that with the impulse frequency that we're putting in, we see a huge degree of synchronization to that exact frequency. On top of
Mm-hmm.
that, we do see this sense of entropy increasing within the brain. So the one that I was talking about before, which is that sort of higher state of consciousness as the papers reported on it. And those have both been reported both by us and by universities separately. So the evidence base
Mm-hmm.
around those is fairly solid.
Entropy means chaos.
Entropy means chaos, yeah.
Yeah.
um, and then beyond that, there is some evidence that in certain ways there is a higher state of functional connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
which is
So that is the extent to which different parts of the brain are communicating with each other.
so
So
basically hearing the colors.
exactly. That would
Yeah.
be a description of the sort of thing you might expect at a very high degree. But this is one that I would say is significantly weaker than is with a psychedelic experience. I would
Hmm.
still, I still strongly believe, and there is evidence from papers that have been put out that the emotions you're feeling and the music are leaning into the visual experience, and they are cross pollinating each other. But it's
Hmm.
not quite to the same degree as with full psychedelic experiences.
Interesting. Well, so it's clear that you have founded Luminate to fuel personal growth and to give those opportunities to people. What has brought you on this journey? And I don't know if there were any interesting experiences that you personally had with your subconscious exploration. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I guess from a personal standpoint, I've always been fascinated by these altered states experiences. I'd been along to quite a few different breathwork sessions and had experienced, yeah, quite a range of different consciousness altering experiences and found them personally incredibly impactful. On top of that, I also knew a lot of people who had been through quite significant experiences. Some people who'd been part of the early research groups with Imperial and had shared their stories around that. Others who may have gone out to the Amazon and had their revelations that way. But I was, through my personal experiences and hearing the stories of others, pretty aware that this was a really powerful space. On top of that, I'd from very early on been keenly following the work of the teams at Imperial and elsewhere and looking at the research that was coming out within that space. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of what drove me towards the question of fulfillment and
Yeah.
inspiration, it's, I guess, a similar but slightly different path where myself and Jay were both working at Jaguar Land Rover together on far future concept vehicles. And through this, we both were originally mechanical engineers, and we went to university together as well. And through this project, looking at far future concept vehicles, we started, instead of trying to design technologies or things, nuts, bolts, bridges, all that side of things,
Yeah.
we instead tried to understand the sort of human desires that sit within things, and then trying to create experiences which would help meet those desires and help people achieve these things.
Yeah.
And that research was fascinating to us and really like drove us and engaged us, and yeah, we thoroughly enjoyed it, but we found that it was very challenging to actually execute fully within a corporate environment.
Hmm.
So at that point, we were living together as flatmates and started chatting like, if we were to try and tackle something ourselves, if we were to try and meet a human desire and create something off our own backs, what would we like to tap into? And that's where this idea of trying to inspire people to live more fulfilling lives was born.
Hmm. That's beautiful. And it has been 4 years by now.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think 5 years since I left Jaguar Land Rover, and then me and Jay both had some separate travels, which we were using that time to research as well. So Jay walked
Hmm.
the length of New Zealand, and I drove a van from Canada down to Chile. And while we were
Wow.
going, we were interviewing people. I think Jay would always say, I remember he got a late night voice message, which was an interview I was doing out in the middle of Burning Man with someone about what
Wow.
fulfillment meant to them, and various things like that, where we were still trying to upskill and prepare for the startup world, but also while seeing a bit of the world and exploring ourselves.
That's interesting. Yeah, definitely. I bet you had lots of interesting insights and conversations at Burning Man.
Yeah.
What has been your personal favorite way to explore your subconscious mind?
Oh, that is a really tough question. Um, a personal favorite. It really depends because there are different things that are useful in different ways. I was fortunate enough to go and join one of the retreats that Synthesis were running um, a couple of years ago now. And that was overall the most powerful exploration experience I'd had. Um, However, obviously that carries the limitations of the accessibility and things along those
Yeah.
lines. So beyond that, I mean, I know it's a shameless plug, but I would say that in everyday home use, Luminate is probably my number one go-to. I used to
Yeah.
meditate a bit more, and now that's sort of taken over that practice for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully that answers that and gives a bit of breadth to the
Yeah. Yeah.
answer.
What retreat was that? Was it a psilocybin retreat or
Yeah,
something of that sort?
yeah, it was.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, do you consider yourself spiritual?
Oh, that is such a good question, and one that I used to be a pretty strong atheist and
Mm-hmm.
really didn't believe in anything along those lines. And as time's gone on, I find myself really flipping backwards and forwards. Half the time, I feel
Mm.
that I'm incredibly evidence based and want everything done through the science. I mean, the fact that we bought an EEG brain scanning setup as soon as we started thinking about this probably shows that scientific side and that
Yeah.
piece
Yeah.
of
Of course.
things. However, I guess I would call myself almost spiritually agnostic in a way, where I would probably say I'm more on the science side slightly, but equally I would never be in a position where I would say that there's no chance that this spiritual world exists. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say that overall, I probably don't know enough to have a strong enough opinion in a lot of ways.
It's a diplomatic answer.
Yeah, but I think I don't know. I feel it's hard to have confidence in any viewpoint around
For
these
sure.
things because all of them deal with something so ineffable and something so fundamentally unprovable.
Yeah. Yeah.
That I think even if you were to take a scientific standpoint, the only position to hold is we don't know, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
just because you can't devise an experiment to disprove the existence of any of these spiritual beliefs. And therefore, I think I approach them all with an openness and with a
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think, in my personal opinion, the key limitation of science as we know it is that it's very objective. In order to prove something, we need to conduct experiments so that, in 9 out of 10 cases, it's true or false. But there is also a subjective side that cannot be really experimented on. And it gets completely overlooked in a way. And in the traditional understanding of science, which is rational and logical and objective, it's almost impossible. Well, it's impossible to consider something that is intuitive, that you subjectively know or feel from whatever source it's coming. So I guess that's the big reason why it is almost impossible to have science as we know it to prove something so
Yeah,
ineffable.
and especially something so complex as well.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to design an experiment to prove out a very simple hypothesis or question,
Yeah.
let alone
Yeah,
to
exactly.
tap into something such a big question, I guess, and
Yeah.
one that's not easily broken down into small pieces.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess my position is open, curious,
Yeah.
and somewhere in between.
Yeah, it's like I had a guest on my podcast recently, Tom Campbell. I don't know if you know him, but he is a very famous physicist who did lots of research on consciousness, and he has tried to create a theory of everything that includes consciousness as a key ingredient to that. It's very fascinating, but the reason I brought it up is that he always says we have to be in the state of open-minded skepticism. So yes, we need to be open-minded, but we need to be skeptical about what is not our experience.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for this conversation. Super insightful, super interesting. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
I would just encourage anyone who's interested to have a play on the Luminate app and let us know how you find it. You can download it free from the App Store or Google Play. And if you want to reach out to us, you can also find our support email details. And we'd love to hear from you and hear how your experiences are. If it works for you, if it doesn't work for you, we're always open to hearing about it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I'll put the details of Luminate into the show notes so that everyone can see them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Best of luck on your journey with Luminate and your personal journey of consciousness exploration.
Thank you very much.